Thank you for joining this webinar today. As announced, Dr. Spector will be today's presenter. So let me briefly explain, introduce Dr. Spector. Dr. Spector's research interests include intelligent support for instructional design, assessing learning in complex domains, distance learning, and technology integration in education. And Dr. Spector is past president of ACT, the largest education technology organization, and has been the editor of ETRD over 10 years, I think. And today, Dr. Spector will talk about his current research project on developing critical thinking skills in young children. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Spector so that we can start.
Well, thanks, Dr. Lee. So I appreciate that. Yeah, I was editor for ETRD for 15 years, and then I stepped down and they wouldn't let me stop working. So we have a section of ETRD now called Feature Papers, and I'm the editor of the Featured Papers section. But yeah, that was one of the most rewarding parts of my life. I thought I would start, I have about 23 slides here. I thought I would start with the last slide. Yeah, and work backwards. So that way you can, play it backwards and you'll know where I'm headed. So so thanks for all those who are here. And here's a what appears to be a research question. It's not really a good research question. Is it possible that a person knows less than that person is inclined to believe that he or she knows? I got this from one of my professors at UT Austin, Bausma, who kept a journal. And one of these remarks in his journal was, I know less than I'm inclined to believe. And so that stuck me for a long time. But this is a bad research question for two reasons. First of all, it looks like it's a yes/no question, which those do not make good research questions. And then if you look at the middle part, know less than that person, who are these people, and know less about what? It's much too vague to be a research question. So we could turn this into a research question and say, well, what percent of high school graduates in Texas believe that they know the capital of all 50 states in the United States? So then it's a lot more specific. But then what percentage? This suggests, okay, well, to find that out, we're going to have a pretty large scale study of high school graduates or high school students in the Texas that's representative of all of those students, and then make an estimate that the percentage of the ones tested represents the whole population. So that was just a remark for the doc students out there thinking about research questions. The other thing that's on the slide is this book of problems. BOP is Book of Problems that Jan Visser initiated at the Learning Development Institute that he heads up. And so maybe, or do you see the screen now, the Book of Problems? Somebody say yes. Hopefully you do.
Yes.
Yeah, great. So he gathered, this is around 2002, I forget exactly when, at AECT, a group of scholars, and the question they were asked to write about and then talk about at this meeting in 2002 was what we don't know about learning. And so here's the people that were gathered. Bransford, some of these people you'll recognize, the Media Lab at MIT, Marcy Driscoll at Florida State. And so people that in a wide range of disciplines, we have artists here, leaders in research, David Jonasson before he passed away, of course. And so then you can scroll down through this, and then you can look at the articles they wrote in responding to that question. The one that I usually send my students to read is David Perkins here. Yeah, 10 Problems About Learning by David Perkins at Harvard. And so this is in 2002. And I think what we don't know, indicated by Perkins, is still active. The question of mechanism about learning and unlearning. And the question about the difficulty, what is it that makes something hard? I'm going to talk a little bit about that. The question of design, how to design something that really is likely to support learning. The question of worth, why learn a particular thing? And then he has these 6 very specific things. So this is just something I would recommend in your spare time for those, and then to work backwards. I think that's all I wanted to say about working backwards. And by the way, feel free, this is being recorded, but feel free to interrupt at any time because I'm easily distracted and I like distractions. So I'll work through the whole slide. So these are sort of the questions that I've been asking myself for a period of time. So what is the nature of inquiry and critical thinking skills? What are those skills? And why should we be teaching those skills to children, which is my focus? And I have shifted from adult learners and college learners to kids. When to start? And I had an interesting discussion with DJ Liu, who's the head of NetDragon, about when to start. And I wanted to start around the 8th grade initially, because I knew with regard to math learning, and according to test scores in the US, around the 8th grade is when things go wrong in the US, where our students are doing well compared with other students around the world until they get to 8th grade. And so I thought, well, maybe that carries over to critical thinking. And DJ's response, no hesitation, when I said the 8th grade, his response was even earlier. And so I think he probably was right. So I've worked out even starting earlier, but language skills are important. So maybe when kids are in the 3rd grade, around 8, they have good enough language skills to deal with some inquiry and critical thinking skills. And then how are we going to make progress? You know, so if you start early, it's not limited to a domain. And then how to make progress and how to measure progress and what stands in the way of progress. So those are the kinds of things I've been thinking about basically for more than 10 years now. And so this is a contribution made by one of a postdoc student at the time. He was at the Smart Learning Institute at Beijing Normal University, Dr. Bhagat, and he got his PhD in Taiwan. And he pointed out that what I was talking about really begins with observation. So if you're going to do this with kids, you have to build up their observation skills. And then some of these examples came to mind about how inquiry and critical thinking really starts from noticing something unusual. And there was a meeting of the National Technology Leadership Summit meeting in Washington, D.C., where the meeting was exploring the next generation science standards. And one of those standards was the notion behind those standards was to integrate engineering into science education, especially in high schools and middle schools. And so we were looking at an 8th grade standard for electromagnetism. And we read this new standard that had been developed by scholars over about a 3-year period for how to support electromagnetism, integrating both engineering and science. And so the idea was, we'll have students build an electric motor and then test it under certain conditions and explain the results. So the testing and explanation part is the science, and the building the electric motor was the engineering part of that activity. And so we tried it out with a bunch of scholars at that meeting, first time we looked at this. And we had 4 groups of PhDs, 5 in every group, trying to implement that 8th grade standard over a 2-day period, and none of the groups succeeded. So we thought, well, how are teachers going to be able to do this in schools if we can't do it? So we wondered, well, let's try it with some kids in the summer, and it'll be a self-selected group, and we'll support these groups. We'll give them a week. We'll give them all of this information that was at the Smithsonian Institute about the Page motor, which was patented, an early electric motor. And we'll also provide them with technical assistance in a 3D printer so they can print the parts needed to build the motor. And so those students, we did that. They did that in 4 different schools in Virginia and the surrounding area in DC. And then we brought those students to the meeting, the next meeting in September in DC with all of these scholars. And the idea of the students was they were going to be given 2 hours to build the motor. And they had access to a 3D printer in case they needed more parts or broke apart. And they already knew that they had the materials about the page motor that was patented from at the Smithsonian, and they had the relevant documents and actually a 3D picture. So the students are building this motor, and the motor is arranged horizontally, so it's meant to turn a wheel, and this shaft goes back and forth in a horizontal manner to turn a wheel. So that was a practical application of that early electric motor. And so this one group, and I was by then observing the groups, in this one group of kids, no adult assistance, are operating on their own from memory of a summer exercise they had done several months earlier, 2 hours to build the motor. And this one group is building the motor vertically, even though all of the material from the Smithsonian has a horizontal armature moving back and forth to move a wheel. And so, being the sort of curious observer, I asked those students, why are you building it vertically? And the students said, we just wanted to see if it would work. And I thought, well, that's amazing. I mean, that showed real inquisitiveness. That's the kind of notion we want to inspire in other students. Of course, it was a self-selected group, but anyway, that stuck with me for a long time. And then later on, I'm going to show you a game of India that NetDragon has implemented. And that came from an essay written by Harry Nielsen in the 1970s, published in the Michigan Quarterly Review. And in the story is a little more gruesome than the game that we developed, that NetDragon developed. But in the story, there's a woman who passes away. This is a place where Nielsen is at a location in India between World War I and World War II, and he's recounting his visit there. And he doesn't speak any of the languages in India, and he's watching people play a game, waiting for the next train to come in so they can unload the trains from the plains, the broad gauge tracks, and then load the trains going into the mountains on the narrow gauge tracks. A lot of free time, and the people working there are playing this game, and he doesn't speak Hindi or Urdu or any of the languages, and he's trying to figure out the rules of the game. And there's this one woman who keeps winning in that game, and so he's wondering, why does she keep winning, and why does nobody object? And anyway, that woman comes into his office and leans up against the door and passes away. This is, I should have warned you, this is an X-rated story, but it's true. And so they take her out and everything. And then he notices there's a wet spot on the door from where she was standing. And he asked himself, or he asked a group of people, what would make a wet spot like that? That question leads to a really interesting discussion in that essay, but I'll leave you with wanting to read that essay at this point. And then there's another case that Tufte records in some of his work on video explanations. And people noticed that there was a cholera epidemic in London in the 1800s, I think. And then eventually they noticed that the preponderance of these cases were in a location around Broad Street. And one of the people's investigating this wondered, why are so many cases near Broad Street? And they located it, isolated a water well that had been corrupted there. And so people drinking water from that well were getting cholera. But the question led to an investigation that eventually turned out to save lives. And then another one is from a story about criminals in the UK and England were being deported to Australia. And it turns out a lot of them died before they got to Australia. So the question there is, why is that happening? And that's sort of a two-part question. Well, they were being deported from England because they didn't have any place, in the jails were too full. And so they decided, well, we'll just send them to Australia. They can't escape from Australia. Maybe they'll do some meaningful work. So that's why they were being deported. And that should be deported and not departed. But they died, and a lot of them died en route. So they did depart before they got there. So the question is why? I'm not going to answer those questions. If you send me an email, I can give you the answer. But the idea is all of those questions led to an inquiry. And so here's a little bit about representations of how people think about critical thinking, how it can be developed when is it best to start that development, and then how can we go about promoting, especially kids? And so I like the picture over here with a child as opposed to the adult thinking about these complex things. So the reason to start with kids is they're just naturally curious. And anyway, so I got interested in this actually a long time ago when I was in graduate school in Austin, and I came across a book by Matthew Lipman, who was a philosopher in New Jersey, and he established the Institute for the Advancement of Philosophy for Children, and he wrote a book called Harry Stottlemyre's Discovery. And what Matthew Lipman was doing in this book aimed at kids in middle school, basically, was promoting the notion of logical reasoning in kids. And so the question he was asking, can we teach kids logic? And should we teach kids logic? And then the answer to can we do it, it turns out yes. And then why do it is because this will carry forward in their learning. But it's written, this book, Harry Stottlemyre's Discovery, it's a book written for the kids. So it's written in language kids will understand, and it's about situation kids encounter that they will understand. And so here's a little bit about the book that Harry finds himself getting the wrong answer in middle school science class. Well, that's a good thing. Getting it wrong is where learning occurs. And so Harry asks himself, how did I go wrong? And then he starts thinking about the nature of thinking, and he discovers logic. He actually discovers some rules for reasoning, and then he decides he's going to spread those rules around among his fellow students. And that's how this book proceeds. It's available somewhere online. I think Shanshan probably remembers where. She's the corporate memory here. She remembers everything. And this is an actually book, a quote from the book about Harry Stottlemyre's Discovery. And Lippmann settled on the name Harry Stottlemyre because it sounds almost like Aristotle, who codified the notion of syllogisms as a way to codify a logical reasoning in terms of arguments that were valid and invalid. And so some argument forms are valid, and then those are codified in Aristotle's work. And then Harry writes to himself, he's thinking about all of these things, and his basic discovery is he's thinking that not only is learning science, electricity, magnetism, and gravitation important, but learning about thinking is what's important. So thinking must be something special. And so when I read this, I translated thinking into learning must be something special. So in school, we think about math and spelling and grammar and everything, but who ever heard of thinking about thinking? And then I think about, we don't think enough about thinking about learning, and at least in my discipline here in learning technologies. So we need to devote a little more time to thinking about the learning side of things and not be so fascinated with technology. Am I stirring up any anguish among listeners here? It's not about the technology, it's about the learning. It's not about the technology, it's about the use of technology. It's not about the technology, it's about the use of technology to support learning. It's about learning. Anyway, of course, you know, all of the things I have to say are probably obvious and appropriate for kids because my focus lately is on children. And some of you may be familiar with Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. And Lewis Carroll, that's actually not his actual name. His actual name is Charles Lutwidge Dodgson. And Dodgson is a logician, it turns out. So there's a connection between Alice in Wonderland and Harry Stottlemyre. Both Matthew Lipman and Dodgson are logicians. Anyway, here's some quotations from Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. This is a great book, 1865. You know, all the great books were written before any of us were born, I think. Anyway, in that case, in the middle of the book, you know, Alice encounters Humpty Dumpty and they're having a conversation. And Humpty Dumpty says, in that case, we need to start afresh and it's my turn to choose a subject. And then Alice thinks to herself, he thinks about it as if it were a game. And so then Humpty Dumpty asked Alice, how old did you say you were? and listen to the words. How old did you say you were? And then when I read this, I'm thinking about Ludwig Wittgenstein, an Austrian a philosopher whose book that was published after he passed away, Philosophical Investigations. Wittgenstein introduces the notion of a language game to understand people's thinking. So this notion of language games that Humpty Dumpty basically and Alice are playing resonates well with me and Wittgenstein's work in Philosophical Investigations in an earlier book called Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. And Alice, anyway, tries to answer the question, how old did you say you were? And she says 7 years and 6 months. And then Humpty Dumpty, like Gagne, would pound his fist on the table, get angry, and say, you never said a word like it. And then Alice's response is, I thought you meant how old are you? So this is the language game playing out. And Humpty Dumpty says, if I had meant that, I would have said it. And then Alice didn't want to get into an argument, so she said nothing. And so this is the way I am. So I don't like to be contentious. So I just shut up when people say things that I think are crazy. And I think the dean can testify to that, right? I never speak out, I don't want to upset anybody. My students don't believe that anyway. 7 years and 6 months, Humpty Dumpty repeats, and he said, I would have left off at 7, but it's too late now. And then Alice in the game says, I never ask advice about growing. So this is an interesting game. So the rules of discourse here are interesting. So they're shifting topics. And so what controls this shifting topics? And they agree to engage in this discourse. So there must be some sense behind it. Too proud, Humpty Dumpty asked. And Alice says, one can't help growing older. Anyway, so that's a little dip into Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, written by a logician. So I recommend that all of you adults listening in, go back and read that book. Read Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and read Harry Stottlemyre's Discovery. These are books for kids, and adults can learn something from reading those books. So I hope I'm not insulting your intelligence, but of course, because I'm a professor, I have to give an exam. And so I want you to take out a piece of paper. One piece of paper should be enough to respond to this exam. And there's just 3 questions here. And so the first question is, what do Harry Stottlemyre and Alice have in common? So remember Alice? This is a story about Alice. What do Harry and Alice have in common? And then the second question is, these are easy to answer, right? You're probably going to pass this pre-workshop exam. When is it best to help someone to develop good critical thinking skills? Is it too early for Alice or Harry to learn how to think critically? And how can one go about helping students develop these critical thinking skills? What kind of language games might we engage in with our students to promote these skills? So those are the 3 simple questions. I'll give you some time to write down your answers. You're going to have to send these to me to get a passing grade for this workshop. So be sure and be complete in what you write. Sean, if you're out there and I've left out anything important, just let me know. Yeah, I'm going to ask Sean to grade your pre-workshop exam. She didn't know she'd have this task, but she's here. So, our job as professors is to take advantage of our students, right? So here's a game of India. So I came across this essay, as I told you, when I was in graduate school by Harry Nielsen. And so I'm engaging at this time with NetDragon, and they're asking me about, how are we going to promote these skills? And so one of the things I told them about was this game of India. And so the idea is these people are sitting in a circle and they have some coins placed in front of them and they're just staring at the coins. This is the person that's interacting. And let me actually switch if I can find it, to the game. So they're sitting in a circle watching this game. So this is a VR setting, but observers can watch what the person who's actually engaged here is watching the play of games. And the game is called High. So when someone yells hi, that means they grab all the coins and they're the winner. And this old guy is winning all the coins. And so the first level of this game is for the observer to figure out what are the rules of the game, and the observer doesn't speak their language. And so the observer has a colleague and asks, well, do you know what the game might be? And maybe they have some answer. I'll skip ahead a little bit. And so then they ask, well, this friend has a rule book for games. And they say, well, let's look up and see if this game of hi is in the rule book. And it turns out it's not in the rule book. And so then the games urges them to, well, this guy wins unusually, but most of the time the old guy's winning. So eventually the game urges the VR observer to take a closer look. So the first thing is the observer walks around and takes a closer look. So you might have noticed something there. This old guy calls hi and wins again. So eventually the observer sits down inside the game in the circle and they see a fly land on the coin of someone, and it turns out the fly determines the winner in this game. So I'll stop it there. Thanks, Shan. She made this available because I always lose track of the game video that was recorded. So the first level of this game is to determine the rules by observing something the person doesn't understand. And then there's a second level that hasn't been implemented yet. So once they determine the rule for how the winner is determined, the fly picks the winner in this game. And then the second level is this old guy kept winning. So they had walked around several times and now they're wondering, well, okay, the fly picks the winner, but why is this old guy winning all of these games most of the time and nobody's objecting? So that's a harder question. So that's the idea that there's a developmental sequence here. So asking questions, finding an answer, and that answer leads to another question that's a little more difficult and finding the answer to that. So thanks to NetDragon, we have a NetDragon person online with us, Yunnan. So welcome, and thanks to NetDragon for supporting this effort. So Game of India, this was the first one that NetDragon developed. We had other examples that I'll show a little bit, but not of the actual games that were developed by NetDragon, but other approaches. And so NetDragon thought they could develop a game more quickly in their VR environment than they could with the normal learning environment. Anyway, so we did that. So.
Dr. Spector, we have a question in the chat.
Oh yeah, please. I'm not looking at the chat box, so thanks.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks.
So the question is from Dr. Lean. And the question is, I wonder what we are gaining and losing from watching movies out the book compared to reading the original books.
Yeah, that would be an interesting research question. So yeah, reading the essay and then, what's learning, but the idea in the game, because it's a game and you can sort of suck someone in because you don't succeed, but you want to succeed. I want to figure out how the winner is determined in this game so that it's like more than one engagement. So the learner gets involved multiple times. And it's a little bit continuing the notion of simulation-based learning. So it's interactive. You can engage as many times as you like. And I didn't mention about the natural language interface, but I'll come to that later. So they didn't do the natural language interface. They just had the prompts in text on the screen. But eventually we want the games environment or the application environments to talk to the learner just as a human tutor would talk to the learner. A long time ago when intelligent tutoring systems were coming on into the world, the ITS people made the claim that an intelligent tutoring system would have the same impact as a human tutor. And they oversold what an intelligent tutoring system could do. And they had evidence to show that a human tutor could create a 2 standard deviation improvement in mathematics learning with kids about the same age as Harry Stottlemyre and Alice. And then they did some studies on intelligent tutoring systems that were aimed at promoting the same math skills. And the best they ever got was a 1 standard deviation improvement. They did get improvement, but they didn't live up to their clue that a computer tutor would be just as effective as a human tutor. And my notion is that, so the language interplay that occurs with the human tutor and the tutee is what's missing in the intelligent tutoring system. So we don't have that. So we need a natural language interface that really just encourages the learner to keep working, keep trying. So I've promoted this idea with NetDragon, and on one visit to Fuzhou, I took Jonah Mancini, who developed a learning environment in Austin for a museum. And when the person enters the museum, and it has a natural language interface using IBM's Watson. And so Jonah, and it also was a 3D system. So the person comes into the museum, it's a large museum, and the idea of there's a console or this setup there, and the person wants to look at, but they don't have time to look at everything in the museum. They want to focus on something specific. So they go up to the console and they can ask a question, where can I find the display on new art or modern art or something like that? And the system responds with a visual representation, a 3D representation of the museum showing where it is, and they understand the question. And then the system talks to the learner. It's on the 3rd floor, in the west wing of the 3rd floor or something like that. So the system can understand the learner, the person entering, because it's a fairly restricted language dedicated to things in the museum and dedicated to exhibits and locations. And so there's this limited natural language processing that Jonah knew how to do. And I wanted to promote the same thing with the applications at NetDragon. Anyway, so early on, there's this discussion or difference between inquiry and critical thinking. And then the history of things, so the people supporting inquiry learning tend to lean towards these open-ended discovery learning environments that have been shown to be not very effective. And then, so there's a problem with that. And the people promoting critical thinking have tended to lean towards a specific subject domain and learners that are older than the learners I want to teach, because they will argue that critical thinking is domain specific and best learned when you're in college or you're an adult. And I think both of those groups don't see the things they have in common and have gone down the wrong path. And so things can be done earlier, especially because kids are naturally curious about so many things. And that's what should be promoted with childhood learning. And then it can be promoted in a way that leads to critical thinking, because when you look at these definitions, there's some overlap with inquiry, asking questions, making discovery, like Harry Stottlemyre, In Search of New Understanding. And then the critical thinking skills talks about, analyzing what's happening, assessing, reconstructing the events, and so forth. There's a lot of overlap in these skills, and I just picked some standard definitions for inquiry skills and critical thinking skills. We had people, I'll show the team members in a little bit. Oops, I lost, because I left this. I'm not in the display mode. There we go. I'm back in full display mode. Sorry, I forget what I'm doing, which is typical. So I'm not as highly focused as Sherlock Holmes, and I'm more like this thinker guy who's, he's actually, you don't see this, but he's sitting next to the refrigerator. And so he's easily distracted by what's in the refrigerator. This is me over here. So this is the team, so the research team. So this project is going through the Texas Center for Educational Technology that's headed by Professor Lin, and it's being funded by the NetDragon company that's led by DJ Liu in Fuzhou, China. And I've had the pleasure to visit there a couple of times, incredibly impressive location. If you look this up, look at NetDragon in Fuzhou, and you'll see the location in China. I should have had a screen here to show it. But the main building looks like the Starship Enterprise. It really looks like the Enterprise. And so DJ Liu has created a campus environment in Fuzhou that invites people to be there. And he has funded the Smart Learning Institute at Beijing Normal University. He's also funded a community college that's in a relatively remote part of Fuzhou, is on the southern coast of China, across from Taiwan. So it's not near Shanghai, it's not near Beijing, it's not near any of the larger cities. Although in China, the notion of a large city is something like Shanghai or Beijing. Either one of those cities has a population that's about approximately equal to the entire population of the state of Texas. So you pick one city in China that has 20 million people. It's like the population of Texas. I was on a visit one time to a city in China, not Fuzhou, but a remote city. And the name of it is escaping me at the moment, but it'll pop back into mind. And on the way there, I was traveling with some doctoral students by train, by the fast train, that goes 380 kilometers an hour. Anyway, and so I asked one of the students about this city, because I'm going to give a talk there, and so I want to know something about it. And so I asked, is it a small city, large city? And they said, no, it's just a small town. So we get to this city, and I get to the hotel, which is amazing that they put us in this really like 5-star hotel. And I get on the internet while I'm there, and I look up the population of the city, and it's like 8 million people. And so 8 million in China is considered a small place. So, well, that really was an education all in itself. So anyway, continuing with members of the team, there's a lot of people have contributed to my efforts over the years. And then there's Professor Gu at East China Normal University. She heads the Educational Information Technology or Educational Science group at ECNU. And so UNT has a memorandum of agreement there also with the Smart Learning Institute at Beijing Normal University. So on one visit to East China Normal University, I'm talking to the graduate students and the faculty there, and I'm mentioning a little bit about my interest in critical thinking, but the main talk is about instructional design. So I tell them a little bit about my background and how I've changed over the years. I used to be interested with adult learners and simulations, but now I'm thinking about young learners and how to promote critical thinking. And then I start talking about instructional design, which is the main topic for these people. And so I give my spiel on instructional design. It's important to clearly know your goals and objectives. And it's as soon as you identify those goals and objectives, the next thing to do is to write assessments, develop the assessment methodology. So I emphasize this a lot. I go away and I come back 3 months later, and they say, we want to show you something, Mike. And I said, well, what is that? Well, we said, you talked about critical thinking skills, and you want to test those you want to develop those for kids, and you're thinking about games, because I had this interest with NetDragon. And they said, well, we've developed a game to assess critical thinking skills. And so it turns out the game was based on what's called the Cornell Test, which is, they have 2 versions of this test. One is for children, one is for adults. And the original Cornell Test had about 79 questions. And there's some researchers in Taiwan that had created 79 questions. Is a lot of questions to ask a middle school kid to answer. So in Taiwan, they said 79 is too many. We'll take 49 of these core questions, and we'll use those to determine the impact of these interventions with kids to test their critical thinking skills. And so they had the Taiwan test, and they had found that in Shanghai, and they said, well, we'll take those 49 questions and we'll turn that into a game. And it'll be kind of an exploring game where you're trying to find or rescue a friend, and you're in this maze of rooms. And every time you're in a room, you either find your friend, which doesn't happen early in the game, or you have to go to another room. And to leave that room, you have to answer a question. And it's one of the questions that it's on this Taiwan version of the critical thinking. So I'm amazed when I see this, that, okay, these people actually listened to what I said 3 months ago. I wish my students would do that. I have some students online here. So yeah, 3 months from now, if you remember anything I say, I'll give you a gold star. Anyway, so that's so there's folks not only at NetDragon and at the Smart Learning Institute, but also at East China Normal University, who've informed my thinking over the years. And then we had the pleasure, I hosted a researcher he came from Leuven University in Belgium, DeWitt Tirounet, and he came for a summer research visit while he was finalizing his dissertation. And his dissertation was on critical thinking with adult learners in physics. And so that started a dialogue with DeWitt. And his view was critical thinking skills were domain specific. They wouldn't transfer from one domain to another. And they're best learned when you're an adult or in college, studying physics in his case. And so it was a great dissertation. He was extremely bright. He got a postdoc position in China and eventually ended up at the University of Cambridge. And so we had this dialogue, and eventually I brought DeWitt around to thinking, maybe you're right, Mike. Maybe they are not so, there's some of these skills that are transfer from one domain to another, and they can be learned earlier. So he came around, very, very bright. And then another very bright person that we tried to recruit to UNT, and we actually had recruited him, but he decided to go back to India to be with his family, was a Dr. Kushal Kumar Bhagat. And I met him when he was a postdoc student at the Smart Learning Institute in Beijing. And he visited me the first time I went to Fuzhou and met DJ Liu and presented my ideas about critical thinking. And at the time, Dr. Bhagat was presenting a project, his dissertation project he had worked on in Taiwan about an intervention about geography. And he had a very interactive globe, three-dimensional globe that students could interact with to learn about geography. And he thought, and that had been developed in Taiwan, but it could be developed into sort of an exploratory kind of game, maybe by a NetDragon. So KK was interested in presenting that, and I was interested in presenting my ideas about critical thinking to DJ Liu. And that's when I told DJ, I think, he asked me what age, and I said, well, about the 8th grade, and DJ said even earlier. So that got me to thinking DJ was probably right. And so we started working on it earlier. So yeah, I'm part of this team. And Shanshan Ma, who just recently successfully defended her dissertation, which was a manuscript style dissertation aimed at this project. She's sort of the brains behind all of this. She's online and she's been working on this. And another doctoral student has been working with Shanshan on this effort at the Texas Center for Educational Technology, Tatiana Kusher, who came to us from Ukraine. And her dissertation will be on something somewhat different. I think it's going to focus on second language learning, but she's worked on this project as well. But Shanshan has done a lot of the work on this, and I'm going to show some of her work and some of my work. So I came to this, as I mentioned, from early work with Harry Stottlemyre. When I was a doctoral student, I became aware of that book, and it stayed with me over the years, and then I put it aside. And then I was in Norway for 4.5 years as the head of educational information technology research there, and a rewarding time. And I had a doctoral student, Marcelo Milrod, who had a faculty position in Sweden, but was getting his PhD from the University of Bergen. And Paul Davidson was the head of the System Dynamics group at the University of Bergen. And I was just there as the head of educational information science and technology. And so Marcelo's work, again, it was a manuscript style dissertation that he pursued. And he had a number of papers that got published in this area. And he was working with kids in Sweden, and again, with younger kids. So I was being pushed in this direction to look at kids, Mike, look at kids. Of course, it took me about 30 or 40 years to realize the focus should be on children. So we developed together, this team developed what we call model facilitated learning. And sort of the effort got published in a book edited by Sam Naidu a scholar from India, but he was in Australia at the time. And the book is Learning and Teaching with Technology. And so in that book, what Marcelo did was with his kids, which we codified as a process within system dynamics, supported learning environments, was you start with exploration. And Marcelo's group was starting with kids exploring plant growth. And the kids in the school in Sweden were creating, it was a competitive environment where small groups of kids would plant things that could grow and then be herbs that could be sold to various people. And so he was encouraging kids to explore, to compete with each other, who could grow the best herbs more quickly. And he had an environment where they could grow these and they could control the light and they could control the fertilizer and the water in this environment. So three things were under their control and they were trying to balance those to promote the growth. And then try to create a puzzling or novel situation for kids can't explain what's happening if you have too much light or too much fertilizer. It seems like fertilizer is good up to a certain point and then it kills the plants. So why does that happen? You can't explain that right away. And it causes, well, we have to explore this and think some more. And then that forces someone to develop a hypothesis, test it, refine it in the system dynamic, in a simulation-based learning environments, and all of the system dynamic-based learning environments were interactive that way. And Marcelo's environment involved a logo application, Lego logo application, that where it was physical, but they could control certain variables. So the idea was to give learner control over some things, but then the idea was to control which things, when the learner should have control and why it's important for learners to have control there. So there's a lot of research questions to promote active learner engagement. And then the idea was to also adopt an organic approach. You don't learn everything in one simulation or in one game. So that to learn critical thinking or develop these skills takes time. And it's a progressive development over time. And the idea early on is to every stage challenge learners by having them answer or respond to serious questions or puzzling situations, and then provide opportunities for reflection. Then the work we did with Paul Davidson, the reflection and the learning typically occurs in between interactions with a simulation. So now the small group is trying to talk about, well, what happened when we increased the fertilization or when we did X in the simulation? So the learning occurs offline in between game runs. So this, Shan led a group effort to look at she gets credit for this, for the nature of critical thinking, doing the literature review. And so this is just a quotation from her work. And it turns out that critical thinking is a developmental process. And here are the things involved: experience, inquiry, investigation, examination, exploration, argumentation, developing logic skills. That goes back to Harry Stottlemyre. Testing conclusions, hypothesis testing, sort of the scientific method, evaluating assumptions, and so on. So that came from an effort that Shan led into, that was her first paper in her dissertation. Tell me if I'm wrong, Shan, because I'm often wrong. Anyway, the literature review that underlies all this work. And so the way I summarize that, so the critical thinking, it involves abilities, dispositions, the level of the learner, the situation, how much time is involved, the context, the knowledge, and emotions, attitudes, and motivation. So this is a lot of variables affect progressive development of critical thinking skills. Then of course, in the back of my mind, so I'm bridging this world between philosophy and computer science, and Herbert and Stuart Dreyfus are brothers. One of them is a computer scientist and the other one is a philosopher. And together they wrote a book called Mind Over Machine, published around 1980. And the argument in that book is that they can develop, the computer scientist and the philosopher agreed, they can identify these stages of development over time, from an absolute beginner to somebody who becomes a competent performer, somebody who becomes proficient, and then somebody who becomes highly proficient and expert, but then there's something they don't understand. They can't explain how someone makes this transition to a guru, someone who becomes really a holistic thinker, absorbed in what's happening, intuitive, can respond to aspects of the situation. You may know, I'm curious if anybody can identify. I have met a few people at this master level. I put myself somewhere between competent and proficient in the things I attempt to do. So I'm somewhere down here between competent and proficient. But I've met a few people at this master level. Bausma is one of those people. When I was he was in his last year before he retired at UT Austin when I was a doc student there. So Utskul Bausma, OK Bausma is one person I would put in that category. Robert Gagne is another person I would put there. So you can recognize these people who just have this, can be totally absorbed in what you're saying. They understand the situation. They take a holistic view, and they just have an intuitive understanding of what you're about. I could tell lots of stories about Gagne or about Bausma to illustrate what it is to become a master. But my point is, we can recognize this master level when we see it. A few of us are lucky enough to encounter someone at that level, but most of us are somewhere in the middle here. I'm wondering if any of you have recognized a master in your travels across this planet. If anybody wants to volunteer. So it's okay to speak out, you know. You have a voice. You have the chat box, which I'm not monitoring because I'm limited to one screen and I don't want to take up screen space with the chat box. Anybody want to volunteer?
Yeah,
master?
Dr. Spector, this is Zain, one of the people that I have worked with. His name is Lakshma. He is truly a genius on the technology side. You give him any kind of challenge from infrastructure, database, system, application, he can figure it out and he'll come up with some brilliant ideas.
What was his name and where is he located, or where was he located?
So his name is Lakshma Likhi. He used to be part of my team in a previous life. And then I also partner with him, and he is based out of Dallas.
Oh, okay. Yeah, can you put his name and that information in the chat box so we can have it to save it? Thanks. Anyone else? Well, that brought to mind another person I thought of was, God, his name was in my head and now it's gone. Yeah, how does the brain work? Or how, in my case, how does the brain not work? Well, anyone else want to volunteer while I try and remember his name? I was going to give a third person that what Zane was saying reminded me of someone else.
I'll fill in the blank. One of my advisors, Patricia Quentin, she passed away already. But, you know, what you said about the intuition, intuitiveness, that really struck me. A lot of times when she would say something, and I was thinking maybe it's more complex. But then I would go around and spend a lot of time and come back with the solution or decision that she said, you know, at the beginning. So the intuitive decision and this, you know, it really strikes me as, you know, the one of the characteristics of being a master in a specific skill.
Yeah, I could tell a story about Bausma. It's a little bit embarrassing, but I've told it before, so I could repeat it here. So after he retired from UT Austin, he would still come up to the philosophy department on Fridays if nothing else was happening. And he would be in a conference room. I had this wonderful, huge conference table. And then the doctoral students would gather there and ask him questions, just to meet with him and ask him questions after he retired. And so, and I would often take notes at this session. And then I had learned by then to keep my mouth shut because, you know, I had learned that I know a lot less than I'm inclined to believe I know. Better if I just listen and take notes and circulate the notes. Back then we had the mimeograph machines, you know, we didn't have computers anyway. So I'm the note taker sitting next to Bausma. And this one guy brings up, he wants to talk about John Locke, John Locke's theory of substance and properties. And probably because he's taking a course with Locke and he has to write an essay and he wants to get Baalsma's take on this. And so Baalsma's take would just be to ask questions. So he asked the question, well, what do we know about properties? At first he asked for the passage in John Locke that was confusing the student or prompting the question. And so we have a paragraph from John Locke's work on in metaphysics on properties and substance. And then Baalsma asks the question, well, what about properties? And then there's this discussion that goes on about properties for, I don't know, half an hour. These are usually 2-hour sessions. And then Baalsma would stop and say, well, what do we know about substance? And then nobody says anything. And we know what Locke says. He says the substance is, I know not what, is Locke's answer. And so Baalsma is emphasizing, we know a lot about properties, we hardly know about substance. So, and Baalsma's had enough of this conversation. He's not interested. He's just prompting us to discuss the issue. He gets to the conclusion that we know a lot about properties, nothing about substance. And so Baalsma wraps it up by saying, I guess substance is what properties get stuck in. So he makes this joke. Everybody laughs. And so it really encapsulates Locke's metaphysical theory that, you know, the substance is an X, I know not what. So, and you can't talk about it. Wittgenstein would say, what we cannot speak about, we must pass over in silence. That was his last remark, and the only book he published in his lifetime, the Tractatus. And what he meant was, what we cannot speak about clearly, we must pass over in silence. Don't bring it up. So substance, nothing to say about it. Forget it. Anyway, so then Jimmy Kraft, who was same group I am, you know, at that time we're both, you know, completing our dissertations. And Kraft asked questions. So he takes he sees Baalsma's board and he sees that's the end of that discussion. Let's move on. And so Kraft asks the question, can we talk about Plato's Symposium? And that's one of Plato's dialogues. And so Baalsma's, he's you know, not an attractive guy. He's in his 80s at this time. He's wrinkled, thinning white hair, pale blue eyes, wrinkled face, kind of a bulbous nose. Baalsma cocks his head and poses the key question in Plato's Symposium, what is love? So instead of what is substance, Baalsma really wants to talk about what is love. So this is an interesting change in the discussion. And then I decided I was going to say something. You know, Mike makes the big mistake. And so Baalsma had made a joke about substance is what properties get stuck in. So I said out loud, unfortunately, love is what people get stuck in. And Baalsma had a hearing aid in his right ear. And so, you know, he was aging. And so he looked at me. I was on his right side taking notes. And he looks at me just straight through with those piercing blue eyes and made me repeat it. What did you say? And I knew he heard me. And because everybody had laughed. And so people at the end of this large table had heard me. And so I knew I was in trouble. So I had to repeat it. Love is what properties get stuck in. And Baalsma's still staring right through me. And he says, I thought it was the glue that binds us together. And so Baalsma had this idea to be totally absorbed, very intuitive, understanding the situation, and just right on target about what the real issue was. And changed my life, actually, at that point in time. Anyway, that's my story about Baalsma, one of these masters. But we're stuck here in the middle trying to make the best sense we can of things we experience. Now, this is Shanshan's work. This is the second piece of her dissertation. So she led the group that did the literature review, which was an important work. And from that literature review, she developed this 4-dimensional framework for critical thinking. If you want to talk through this, Shanshan, I'll let you say this if you want to.
I'm good, thank you.
You want to talk about it?
No, thank you.
No, you're saying no thanks or yes, please? Yes,
all right.
please.
Okay. Okay, I just briefly just mention this framework. So this framework was built based on the literature review as Dr. Spector introduced before. So it's basically depict the component element involved in critical thinking and about the interrelationships. So as you can see, we also mentioned the level is this also adopted the work by the Raffers, I guess.
Dreyfus, yeah, Dreyfus and Dreyfus, yeah.
Dreyfus, yes. So this was built on the previous work. So we expect to provide a complete understanding of critical thinking. So then can help the individual, especially students or teacher, to locate the right strategies to develop critical thinking. Thank you, Dr. Spector.
No, thank you, because what this represents is all of the things these researchers had talked about in the literature reviews. So none of them talked about all of these things. But as we consolidated all of those discussions from psychologists, from philosophers, epistemologists, and from educators, Shanshan developed this very robust way of thinking. And then that led, and I had independently developed this 9-phase framework for critical thinking before we got started. And so this was partly inspired by Gagne's 9 events of instruction. So I'm thinking about what about the 9 phases of developing critical thinking skills? And I thought, well, it could be like Gagne's 9 events, which if you remember Gagne's 9 events, they're not meant to be linear. So they can cycle through these things, but you gradually build towards this transfer of knowledge and understanding. And this is 9 events of learning, of instruction. So my idea was, and then NetDragon wanted this, and they wanted these developed at every level. And then they wanted to know component skills for going from inquiry and puzzlement into exploration, into reasoning about things. This is what I was trained to do, to understand logical reasoning, difference between influence, causality, explanations, coherence, and consistency. The second meeting I had with DJ Liu reminds me of this interest in logic. And we were in a hotel room, I think it was in Shanghai, but I could be misremembering. It could have been Beijing, I forget. And he had maybe a half a dozen of his developers with him in the room. And we're talking about this project that is evolving, not yet funded at that time by NetDragon, but clearly he's interested. And so he's asking me about this coherence and consistency. And so he asked me, let's try this. Give me some examples of things. And I explained that one of the ways to develop this is to have kids, like in Harry Stottlemyre's book, discover things that don't make sense, that are inconsistent. And so DJ asked, and he recorded it at the time. He pulls out a smartphone. He said, we're going to record this. And so he has another person taking a video of it. He's recording what I'm saying. He says, let's show me some examples of inconsistent, of contradictions, and see if we can. He challenges me to do this. And so then, of course, I had no choice. When you're talking to DJ, you need to respond. So I responded with a version of Russell's paradox. So I said, in this hotel room, there were maybe 8 or 10 people now in this large suite in this, 5-star hotel. I said, there's someone in this room who loves all and only those people in this room who do not love themselves. So Russell's paradox was a little bit different than that, but that was a statement that can't be true. But there's someone in this room who loves all and only those people in this room who do not love themselves. And then I said, who is it? And then there's silence, because, and I've tried this, actually, I tried it recently with my grandson, who's now interested in logic. So this is, maybe I've corrupted the youth like Socrates did, and pretty soon I'm gonna have to drink the poison. Anyway, there was silence. Nobody could explain that. I said, well, this actually is Russell's paradox. And then I said, it's actually a version of something that was discovered by a monk in the Middle Ages that people overlooked for 400 years. And so DJ, well, what was that thing that the monks discovered? And I said, there was a monk who discovered an interesting paradox. And this is actually true. I found this in the stacks in the graduate library at UT Austin, which used to be in the clock tower building there, but it got moved recently. Anyway, so I asked, so I reported the monk's version of Russell's paradox. And the monk's version was, I just ate the last cannibal. And that didn't work because when it's translated into Chinese, cannibal turns out to be translated like someone who eats people. So I just ate the last person who eats people. They all saw the flaw in that right away, that can't be true, that's inconsistent. So then I said, well, these inconsistencies, you can find them everywhere, that people make these claims that are just nonsense. And I say, politicians are very good at doing this. They disguise the inconsistency. So I said, one thing we have to do in training these logical skills is to identify inconsistencies. So that's a subordinate skill there, next level down. Anyway, that's a dip into DJ and his interest in challenging me all along the way. And so this table came out of that challenge. So for any one of these phases, NetDragon wanted to know, well, what are the competencies that we're going to develop if we have a game to promote inquiry and puzzlement? What kinds of competencies can we develop, observing odysseys and so forth? So I had to develop this. So this was intended to guide their development team, and which I wasn't very good at. I was good with ideas, but not so good with anything beyond having an idea. And usually they're crazy. But anyway, then Shanshan did a study. And so one of the studies goes like this. So we had the literature review, her first paper. Then we had the framework that really consolidated all of these things that the scholars had set into a framework for critical thinking. And then the question is, do middle school teachers think about critical thinking in a way that aligns with that framework? So that was a question that she asked in this empirical study. So again, I might ask you to comment on this, Shanshan, if I miss important things. And then the answer is, now this table just represents frequency count for the people that responded that didn't check everything. So first of all, this was a challenge to do because it was during COVID, of course. And so limited access to teachers, and teachers are busy moving classes online. So teachers are totally overburdened, middle school teachers, in this time frame. So she managed to get some people to respond in Texas. And so then where you find strong alignment, here's one. So reflection turns out to be less emphasized in the scholarly work than it was by teachers. So that's an interesting disparity between what the teachers think, that it gets a high frequency account, and scholars actually would, maybe emphasize that less. And then another one here, problem solving also gets a pretty high mark. So problem solving is highly rated by all of the scholars. These inquiry skills get a pretty much of a high rating. And I have to credit KK for the inquiry and the observation skills, because as I was elaborating that framework, I was mentioning these things, but I'm not telling people how to create a game to do that. And so this actually is a picture of one of the examples of the script that was sent to NetDragon to develop some things to promote inquiry and observation skills early on. So the idea early on in the game is the person would be given maybe a dozen rocks. And I had gathered a bunch of sample pictures from a rock museum in Guangzhou, I think outside Guangzhou, China. Anyway, I could be misremembering where it was. And so I had some pictures of things. And then I got this one, I got off the internet. And so, and the way this plays out is the first level is the student is given all these rocks laid out on a table, and the system says, well, pick any two that you think are similar, and And this is a natural language interface at work that can be done easily at this level. So the student picks 2, and then the system says, why did you pick those 2? And the student gives an answer, and there's no wrong answer at this point. And so the system can respond and say, well, that's interesting. Pick 2 more that you think are similar. And so then the student can pick out 2 more that you think. And so the student picks a couple every time that are similar, and the system is just keep prompting the student to pick a couple more. And then there's a change. And then the system says, pick one that you think is very different from all of the others. And that's why these are presented here. So these are some that don't have easy counterparts in the others. And they might have been picked because they had a similar color to something else, but usually they're not. So eventually the student is going to pick one of these. So the student may pick this geode, for example, and the system will say, why did you pick that one? He says, well, because it has these crystal-like structures, and then there's a sort of white stuff surrounding it, and maybe it was cut in half or split apart, and actually it was. And then, so the system responds again. That's interesting. Pick another one that you think is very different. And then maybe the student goes to the gemstone example and picks that one. Just, well, it's shaped, you know, that might be put into a ring or a necklace or something. It looks like it could be made into jewelry. And so that one, and the system says, fine, pick another one that you think is different. And eventually the student is going to pick this one, the fossil. And then this is where the game levels up. So early on, it's picking things that are similar, picking things that are different, and now explaining the difference. And so this was taken off the internet, but the idea of this one came from a book called Wonderful Life by Stephen Jay Gould. And it's about the discovery of a Canadian paleontologist who's hiking in the Canadian Rocky Mountains in the western part of Canada, around 8,000 feet above sea level, which is right around timberline, and blocking on his name. I'm so bad with names. Anyway, he stumbles across these geodes, and this one resonated with me. I came across the book late in life, but earlier in life, I had been hiking in the Colorado Rocky Mountains around timberline with a geologist friend of mine. And my geologist friend is looking for gemstones, and we're hiking around, and we found this outgrowth where there's a lot of different rocks, and Ken is telling me to be looking for gemstones, and I find a rock with an embedded fossil, and I say, hey Ken, take a look at this. It's pretty unusual. And Ken looks at it, and he's not interested because it's not valuable in his mind. He's after gemstones. So I had this encounter. I had the question. No follow through. Ken's not interested. He's the geologist, so I shouldn't be interested. So I dropped it. But Stephen Jay Gould talks about this discovery in the Canadian Rockies. And so then the question this paleontologist says, well, this looks like the fossil of a sea creature. And we're 8,000 feet above sea level. I wonder how am I doing on time, by the way? I'm totally ignoring time. Am I going too long? And I can talk for another couple hours easily. I meant to ask about time. Somebody should tell me if I've talked too long. Oh, everybody's asleep, so I can keep talking. Okay.
Probably, yeah, I think you're coming to the end anyway. Yeah, we can wrap up maybe by 11:30.
Okay, yeah, that's good. Yeah, I guess that gives me about 15 minutes. Thanks. Yeah, I needed that feedback. Yeah, because I get these, you get old and then you remember these things over time, and you remembering things you learned in your youth. Anyway, so the paleontologist has these questions. He found something that's puzzling. How did this fossil of a sea creature get to be 8,000 feet above sea level? So I'm explaining this to Noah, my grandson, who I test things on. He's my test guinea pig or test bunny. And so I show Noah all these examples, and I say, Noah, how do you think a fossil of a sea creature could get 8,000 feet above sea level? And Noah's answer, it reminds me of the kids with the Page motor building it vertically instead of horizontally. And Noah's answer was, maybe a bird picked it up and dropped it here. I thought, well, that's a really inventive answer from an 8-year, at the time he was 6 years old. when I asked him that. So I thought, well, that's an incredible response. A bird picked it up and dropped it 8,000 feet above sea level. It turns out there's thousands of these things here. And then the next question is, how did they get there and where are they now? And nobody can find them now, they're extinct. So how did they get there? And then the answer is millions of years ago, the Canadian Rockies were underwater. And so that's the answer to that puzzling question. So this idea, yeah, we're getting to the, I'm gonna skip ahead. So, because Kathy may not be online, but she may hear this. So one of the things that got me started on this adventure was an experience during a fire drill at Discovery Park at UNT. And we had to leave the building. We go outside the building and there's thousands of these butterflies around. And so I've never seen so many butterflies. I mean, thousands are outside the building in Denton. So I asked Kathy, where did these butterflies come from? And she says, Canada. And I think she's crazy. I didn't tell her that. I thought I don't know what she's been drinking, but a butterfly cannot fly from Kansas to Texas. So I come back inside, I get on the internet and I find out they're monarch butterflies. And these monarch butterflies migrate every year from Canada to Mexico. And they migrate back. And then all kinds of questions come up. So this is, again, puzzlement leading to questions, leading for an answer. And it's a long way from Canada to Mexico, a couple thousand miles. And so how can butterflies make that trip? And so all these questions, how fast can a butterfly fly? How long do they live? How far can they fly? And then the really puzzling thing, like the Game of India, the thing that the real challenge is, why did that lady or why did that man keep winning those games? Here is, why do 4 generations later, the butterflies manage to go back to the same place in Canada? How is that possible? So here's the final exam. I know we're coming up towards the end of the course. Now get out a new sheet of paper. Don't get the same one you had before. And here's the final exam for this session is, what did Harry and Alice have in common? I want to see if you remember anything that Harry and Alice had in common. When is it best to help someone develop good critical thinking skills? And how best might one go about helping those people, in my case, middle school students, develop those critical thinking skills? So that's your final exam, right? Not any different from the opening exam. But compare your answers from the start to the finish. And then we're here at the last slide, and that will leave time for any questions that any of those of you who are still awake might have and want to hear an answer to. And thanks again to NetDragon for funding this project. And thanks to Lin for hosting it in TCET. And thanks especially to Shan and Tatiana for supporting this work.